Okay, peeps. This is Rasta Pops here with Herb, part two.
Okay, so we are talking about the New Sweden colony that was founded right where we are in Wilmington, Delaware, which was in those days Fort Christina in 1638. And as we walk down through the park, I will be talking about how it came to be that there was a Swedish colony and how it then came to be that that colony was significant, even though it only lasted for 17 years, and why it was significant, and then also about what happened afterwards and how it is that a tiny little village that the Swedes founded on the tip of the Schuylkill River became the center of the American Revolution. Now, the other thing about this site, besides the fact that it's a lovely green space on the east side of Wilmington, and that we have very good fishing, and we permit fishing here when we're open. Um, the other factor here is that this is an Underground Railroad site, and we have found from records and what people said that Harriet Tubman herself came through here twice, helping people escape from slavery. So I'll talk about that some more too. Anyway, the Swedes were interested in a colony for some years before they made an effort to do it. But they uh, decided that they needed somebody that really knew the thing, knew the way to do this, to run it. They picked a guy, when I was in school, we called him Peter Minuet. He's the guy who's supposed to have bought Manhattan for $24 in trade goods from the Lenape. That's a very silly, wildly incorrect story, partly because the guy who came up with it in the 19th century used the current value of guilders instead of the value of guilders in 1625. And so he just wildly miscalculated the amount that the trade goods were worth. But more importantly, the Dutch, who he was working with at the time, were very much into the European style of trading and so forth and buying and selling. The Native Americans, the Lenape, did not recognize the concept of land ownership. They thought that the land belonged to everybody, and if you were a good neighbor, you were welcome to share the land. So the Dutch were giving them trade goods that were really pretty cool: copper cookware, iron and steel tools. This is good stuff. The native people, for all their accomplishments, had not mastered metallurgy, and the Europeans had. So they got pretty excited about the potential for trade. Now, so I will call Mr. Minuet, by the way he signed his name, Pierre Minuit, and that's out of respect. I think that he was a remarkable person. So, with that in mind, we have a situation where the Dutch invented the modern corporation in this period with shareholders and shares and a board of directors. And this was partly because they were not a royalty, they were a republic. And so the king didn't own everything. Well, if the king didn't own everything, then who did? And they came up with this idea of corporations. And they founded the Dutch East India Company to trade for spices in Indonesia. That was a dangerous business because one in four ships that went out never came back. So, from an investment standpoint, you need to have some deep pockets to be able to run a business on that basis. But if they could come back with a load of, for example, nutmeg and mace, they could make a spectacular fortune in Europe selling those spices. So they set up the company, they started trading, and it became spectacularly successful. It was the largest cash generating thing going on in Europe for many years. Well, if that was such a good idea for trading with Indonesia, what about the Americas? And they set up the Dutch West India Company, and they hired a Dutchman, Heinrich Hudson, who we think of as Henry Hudson, um, to explore for them. And he came around and sailed up and down the Delaware River and sailed up and down the Hudson River and sailed various other places and came back and had explored some of that for the English on separate voyages. Then he ended sadly in Hudson's Bay, being abandoned by his crew in a mutiny. But at any rate, the Dutch obtained the maps that he had gotten for the English, as well as the ones that he'd gotten working for them. And they decided that the place to put a colony was up near Syracuse, New York. So they set up the colony way up there, way up the Hudson River. And they weren't doing very well. They were not good at surviving in the climate. They were not familiar with how to live off the land, and they were mostly business oriented. So they were having trouble with food supplies. And they weren't entirely getting along with the native people, but they were doing fairly well. So they went through two governors. And then things started to not work very well. So they hired a third governor, and this is Pierre Minuit. This is where he comes into the picture. He was a very different man from the others that they had hired. He sailed up the Hudson all the way up to Albany, 3 or 4 days by sailboat at the time, and said, "Why did you put the trading post here? It should be down in that big, beautiful harbor that we just sailed through." So he moved the entire colony down to the lower tip of Manhattan, the area that we now call Greenwich Village. Now, since then, a whole lot of fill has expanded the island of Manhattan all the way down to the Bowery. But this was a little further north at the time. And in order to defend the colony, he built an east-west wall the whole way across the island. That wall is now the location we call Wall Street. The Dutch knew the value of canals, so they dug a canal north-south that faced straight out into the Atlantic. And so twice a day, the tides would flush the canal. And anything you needed to flush, you could dump in the canal. So they were doing rather well. They built a number of homes, they built a church, and most important, he'd been given the plans for a fort by a Dutch military engineer, a palisade fort, which is to say upright logs. And so he built the fort there. Now that fort was built based on a 1660 map of the whole area that we have by on an area which is now a city block in Greenwich Village. And we know the size of the block, and from the drawing, it would have essentially filled the block. So we know fairly well the size of Fort Amsterdam because it was right there and it was about that big. And so, having done all that, he was running the colony, and they were indeed being fairly successful in trading with any friendly ship that would come through and trading with the native people. But then the corporation back in Amsterdam got an idea, and they said, okay, we need to make more money. So we want to have tobacco plantations on the Hudson River, because tobacco is the big thing. It's making people rich in several countries, and we want in on this. And we want you to take the native people as slaves. Minuit wrote back that this was a terrible idea. That, first of all, the Dutch were getting about half their food trading with the native people. And that, furthermore, he had seen the native people in some disagreements with one another, And he recognized that these guys were pretty good fighters. Maybe they didn't have a matchlock musket like the Dutch did. Now that's like a flintlock, except it's a big, heavy, almost a cannon that you have to stand on a post. And you fire it, and then you retreat back through your line of pikemen who protect you while you spend 2 minutes reloading. If a bunch of guys are coming at you with a tomahawk and you don't have a whole bunch of pikemen, it's not really a very effective weapon. Not more than once, anyway. So he said, "We don't want to do this. This is a mistake." Well, they took his advice, but they did not like his attitude. So they fired him. And now here he was, a successful colonial governor, except insofar as he had a tangle with the corporation about how to do his job. And he knew that Sweden was interested in having a colony. So he went to his Swedish contacts, some of whom were stationed in Amsterdam, and said to them that, we don't know exactly what he said, but it was along the lines of, "Listen, guys, if I got a deal for you, you can make a fortune trading for furs in the New World, and I know just the place. I surveyed it for the Dutch, and they have no claim to it." And he brought them, once they set up the expedition, he brought them right here. Now, this expedition, this was a very happy cruise. Imagine leaving the coast of Sweden on December 1st and sailing across the North Sea, trying to go up above Scotland in December, and getting hit with a very bad storm and having to pull into the Dutch port of Texel and refit, and then sailing down the English Channel on December 31st and out into the North Atlantic. Now, doesn't that sound like a fun cruise?
Mm.
The reason that he chose that timing was that they arrived here in late March. And he had not only brought people to run the trading post, soldiers, people to build the fort, he brought farmers. He planned ahead. Now, what was so special about this site? First of all, at the time, there was a rock formation, the Wilmington Blue Rocks. That's, those of you that know would know that's our minor league baseball team. The rock formation used to stick halfway across the river. Now, much of it was quarried out during the 19th century because they started building bigger and bigger ships further up the river. They built 10,000 ships in Wilmington over those years, including destroyers for World War I, destroyer escorts for World War II, and a lot of the landing ships that were used in the Normandy invasion. But the ships kept getting bigger and the river didn't. So in order to not have the rocks be a navigation hazard, they were quarried back to the small piece that we now have. It's over there behind me. We'll show you in a moment. So in the meantime, though, when they stuck out in the river cut deep next to them and it formed a natural wharf. And you could take a big ship like the original Kalmar Nickel and tie it up to the rocks and drop a gangplank and not have to row everything back and forth. So that was a big plus for setting up a colony, that you already have the wharf and the river. A second part of it, if you look across the river, you will see some tall trees. If this were that period, that would be old growth forest the whole way across. We're more than 2 miles from the Delaware River. Because of the curvature of the earth and the tall trees, you would not be able to see a tall ship sitting here from the Delaware River. You wouldn't know they were here. Correspondingly, you wouldn't know they were there. But they would need to have a reason to come up this narrow little river, which winds around, in order to even discover that you were here in the first place, if they didn't already know it. Now, the next thing about it was that the rock formation runs off to the north, and the land above the rock formation was good farmland. But on either side, there was swamp. So, in fact, a fort built here would be protected on three sides by a combination of water and swamp, and hard to attack with the technology of the day. And then the another key feature, there was a good place to set up a fort, there was good farmland, there was good fishing, and there was a certain level of secrecy. Another key feature was trade. You want to trade with the local people. Well, the Lenape lived in this area, but if you go up the Christina River, only 5 or 6 miles, you get the Minquas, who were a Susquehannock tribe. And if you go further up the river, right to where Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland all have a mutual corner, Landenberg, Pennsylvania, there was another Minqua village of 2,000 people. They traded by canoe. Well, if you are trading by canoe, you get up to that area by Pennsylvania, you can pick up your canoe and all your gear and whatever you're bringing to trade or you've got trading, and walk 1 mile and put your canoe down in the Big Elk Creek and go down to the head of the Chesapeake Bay at the mouth of the Susquehanna River. The Minqua people were Susquehannocks. They spoke a separate language group than the Lenape. So this gave you trade not only up and down the Delaware River Valley with the Lenape, but trade with the whole central region at the upper part of the Chesapeake Bay and the Susquehanna River behind it. So he had met the Minquas. He had brought along a translator who spoke good Lenape. He understood the value of this location for a trading post. Well, they set up this trading post, and gradually the colony spread to both sides of the Delaware River, from south of Swedesboro, New Jersey, which that's the name the Swedes gave it, up to um, near Camden, and up to the Trenton Rapids, which was as far as the big ships could go in those days, and coming down the um, western side of the river, where the Schuylkill fills in, they built a very small fort and set up the little village and fort of Neakorsholm, which is still there, but today we call it Philadelphia. So they came here, and for 17 years, this was New Sweden. And it would be easy to say that it couldn't have been very successful if it was only 17 years. I would disagree with that. The reason being that when this stopped being Sweden, it wasn't because everybody starved or got killed or something. It was because the Dutch couldn't stand the competition. The Swedes were getting the best furs because they paid better prices, and the native people got along with the Swedes better than they did with the Dutch. So Governor Stuyvesant at Manhattan decided it was high time to straighten out this problem. But he didn't want to start a war between the Dutch Republic and the Kingdom of Sweden. So he hired 500 mercenaries and chartered 7 ships and came over here and first took the outlying parts of the colony and then came here and laid siege to Fort Christina. Now, at the time, Fort Christina was a palisade fort, but it was like Fort Amsterdam, a particular design shown here by the sculptor Carl Millis, who carved all of this monument. You can see there that there are 4 corners with a cannon platform on each of the 4 corners, a large building inside, and a smaller building which was a stable. The large building we know to be about 130 by 30 feet. It was a big building, the typical size, by the way, of a Viking longhouse. Now, this building in the early part of the colony had to be the trading post, the warehouse, the church, the school, and where everybody would come if they were attacked. This sculpting is based on a survey map by a Swedish military engineer, Peter Lindström, that was done in 1654. He measured everything and he included a size scale on the map. So we know from the period units, stangs and refs, if you want to look it up, that that fort, that so-called Star Fort, the square with the cannon positions, was about 290 feet point to point around, the length of a football field, if you will. It was big. If it were still here today, it would basically fill this whole area that we see going back to where the flags are. And so the cannon positions, particularly the two forward ones, had really good command of the river if ships were going to try to come up and attack them. And so when Peter Stuyvesant decided he'd had enough of it, he came up and laid siege to the fort. He put a cannon battery over there across the river. We have maps of this from the Dutch records of the siege. He placed one way back by the tent where I started talking, one beyond the swamp over there, and one beyond the swamp over there. He surrounded the fort. And for about 3 weeks, the Swedes held out. But eventually, they ran out of food. And so Governor Stuyvesant got together with Governor Riesing of the Swedes, and they arranged a surrender. And the terms were remarkable. The terms were, you're surrendering honorably. Running out of food by the customs of war in the day is an honorable surrender. So some of you need to go back to Sweden, your government officials or trading company officials. The Dutch will take you at our expense. The rest of you, please stay here and keep doing what you're doing. You're really good at this. One of the things we've learned about the New Sweden colony is that all of the colonies in the New World, the Europeans in the period after Columbus, all the way through, up to and through the period of New Sweden had the best survival rate. Now, if you study climate science at all, you'll discover that this period was called the Little Ice Age. It was on average about 7 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than it is now. One of the things that that meant was that the rivers, the Hudson, the Delaware River, the Christina River, would freeze all the way across in the winter. People from time to time could walk from Manhattan to Staten Island across the ice. So it was tough conditions, and a lot of the European settlers didn't do very well in it. But the people who came here were Swedes and Finns, because Finland was part of Sweden. And cold weather didn't really bother them very much. So once they were here, they, among other things, right over to my right there where I'm pointing, they built the first 3 log cabins built in the New World. And if you've ever played with Lincoln logs, let me make it clear, the log cabins they built weren't like that. The way the Finns would make a log cabin is they'd go down the length of the log and flatten it into 4 sides so that the logs would stack up on one another nicely, and put a little mud and straw between each set of logs, and you're watertight and you're airtight. And then on the corners, it's not a square cutout, it's trapezoidal, and it's custom made so each corner interlocks. 6 of the cabins from that period still exist. They were that well made, and this is, 380 years ago? So they came here, they survived. The Dutch took over, and for 9 years this was part of New Netherlands. But then the Dutch and the English got into it. And so the Second Anglo-Dutch War was ruining both economies. And they decided to make a trade. The English got New Netherlands. That is, they got the Hudson River Valley, the Delaware River Valley, and that connected their colonies in New England with the colonies down toward Virginia. In return, the The Dutch got 5 forts along the African coast and an island in Indonesia, the island of Run, Rhun. Um, and the Dutch figured they got the better side of the deal. The island of Run is less than 10 square miles, but it is the fifth of the only 5 islands in the world where nutmeg and mace grew. And the Dutch already had claim to the other 4. The English had a legitimate claim to the island of Run. So once they settled that out, now the Dutch locked down the nutmeg monopoly and made an enormous fortune for more than a century after that, trading for spices. The uh, English finally got fed up with that and sent the Royal Navy in and took the biggest island and dug up all the trees and moved them to Sri Lanka and India. So that broke the Dutch monopoly. Um, let's take a minute and talk about the monument here. The monument was given to the United States in 1938 to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the 1638 landing. And they took blocks of Swedish black granite from a quarry. Uh, that, that granite doesn't care about acid rain. Uh, and they sent Carl Millis, their greatest artist, over to construct the monument, to carve it. And he researched all sorts of images and stories. So I had mentioned that he showed Fort Christina, which was named for the king of Sweden, Kristina Vasa. And I say king um, because of the special situation she was in. When she was 3 years old, she was Gustav Adolphus II's only child, and the Vasa family had held the throne for 100 years. Gustav led one too many charges in the 30 Years' War at the Battle of Lutzen and took a bullet through the breastplate. He was wounded, the wound festered. He made it back to Sweden, but he was dying, and he left clear orders that Queen Christina was to be raised as you would raise a prince and was to be the ruler. The Vasa family had held the throne in Sweden for 100 years, and he didn't want it to be given up because his only child was a girl. So they did that with her. Now, when Fort Christina was founded and the Christina River was named, she was 12 years old, but she was being raised and educated as you would raise a prince, not a princess. And so eventually, when she was 18, she had her coronation. And she pulled the royal council together and said something along the lines of, listen, I know what you guys are thinking. You're going to marry me off to some likely prince. And, I'm going to lose forget about it. I'm the ruler. You've all signed the papers for this. Everybody's in agreement. And by the way, under the old Viking law, there's no such thing as a queen. There is, if the ruler is a king. So she took to using the title Queen Christina, King of Sweden. She was literally the girl king until she turned 18, and then she was Queen Christina, the King of Sweden. The movie about her on Amazon Prime is called The Girl King, but they don't really explain the title. That's what's behind it. Now, she is shown there riding side saddle in a gown on a lovely horse. She was a very good horsewoman if you prefer. But in the daytime, when she was doing the state's business, she tended to dress as a man and wear pants. It was very unusual for her to be in a gown, as Millis shows her riding the horse. She was one of the most fascinating women in the 17th century. By the time she was 18, she spoke 6 languages fluently. Not very long after that, when she was traveling the courts of Europe, she could speak, at least conversationally, in most of the local languages. So she was the queen for a while. Um, but then, now when she had been raised, she had the best tutors they could hire. Rene Descartes was one of her tutors. He's the man who invented analytic geometry. But when he had to flee the Catholic authorities in France because they didn't like some of his ideas, he ended up in Sweden. Still, he secretly converted her to Catholicism. When that came out, this woman who had helped negotiate the end of the 30 Years' War, which was a horrible war, think World War II in Europe, and you get an idea of the 30 Years' War. Uh, Even though she had done those things, the Swedes were a deeply Lutheran country. They weren't going to put up with a Catholic queen or king or whatever she was. So she abdicated the throne and she took the Vasa family fortune with her to Rome, where she became the only woman living in the Vatican. There are today 3 women buried in St. Peter's Basilica. 2 of them are saints, and the other one is Queen Christina, who, whatever else she was not a saint. So we have her down here. Millis carves a typical sort of fertility symbol with the mother and baby and the men cutting trees, and he shows Old Sweet's church up on above the head of the lady and baby. He shows farming, he shows fishing, and so isn't this a great place to be? On the very top, he shows the Kalmar Nickel riding on a big crest of a wave, and as we walk around, you may be able to notice that there are various sea creatures swimming in that wave. Here was her father, Christina's father, Gustavus Adolphus, who wanted settlements in the New World, so he's shown in the carving holding a ship. Now, Peter Minuet, I had mentioned, was this rather amazing guy. Thing is, when the Kalmar Nickel was going back in the fall of 1638, they went down to the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean to buy a load of tobacco. And the clever Dutch merchant sold them a load of tobacco. They'd emptied their hold up here, so they had a lot of room. And he also said, I don't know where you're from, but you can make a lot of money if I sell you a big bag of tobacco seeds. But you need a man who knows how to grow tobacco. And I just happen to have this slave over here who knows how to grow tobacco. We do not know the man's African name. That would be great to learn. I'd like to learn it. We do know that the Swedes gave him the name Anthony for the saint and Swart, which is simply the Swedish word for black. So he became Anthony Black in the records. He's mentioned 4 times in the records. The first is that the other ship, the flying Griffin, paid 30 guilders for him. The second thing we learn is that a few years later, 3 or 4 years later, he has worked off his purchase price and is now a free man. Now that's a rather interesting thing, because since when do slaves get to work off their purchase price? That's indentured servants. And some of the workers here were indentured servants. So how did that work? Well, it's probable that the issue was when the new governor, Governor Prince, the gentleman shown in this carving and another one, arrived, because on the return voyage, Pierre Minuit had joined another ship for dinner and been hit with a hurricane and was never heard from again. So they sent over Governor Prince. When he arrived here in this time period, the question came up, is this Swedish territory? We claim we've bought it from the native people. Doesn't that make it Sweden legally? Of the modern European nations, the first one to outlaw slavery was Sweden, and they did it in about 1555, almost 100 years before the period that we're talking about. And so if this was legally Sweden, then how could Anthony be a slave? The first African person that we know of in the Delaware Valley. How could he be a slave? So it is probable that the way they solved that conundrum was to say, oh, well, he owes the company 30 guilders, the Swedish West India Company, because that's what he cost. So, okay. The um, Swedes, therefore, gave him his freedom. The next thing we learn about him is that he had been a West African Atlantic Ocean fisherman before he was taken as a slave by a Dutch ship. And he was really good with small boats. Well, the way Governor Prince, being 340 pounds and about 5'6", the way Governor Prince got around the colony was by boat. And Anthony ended up in charge of the governor's boat because he was really good at reading the winds and the waves and sailing the boat. And when the winds were foul, he had 6 Swedes pulling for him. The last thing that we learn is that he'd been granted a license to trade for furs with the Lenape. He spoke fluent Lenape by that time. That's the way you got rich in New Sweden, was trading for furs. Now, I keep mentioning furs. If you look at the paintings of the Dutch masters, many of them are wearing these big, broad brimmed hats, not made out of synthetic today's materials like mine. They were made out of beaver felt. Now, the way you make that is you take a beaver hide and you scrape it off and you felt it into a cloth, and you get this nice brown cloth that breathes and stays cool in the summer. It's warm in the winter. It's absolutely waterproof because it's beaver fur. And remember, the Dutch Republic was getting really rich in this period. So having a status symbol like a beaver fur hat worth costing in those days the equivalent of maybe $15,000 or $20,000, that was a big fashion statement. But if you think about the New York fashion industry, it's not that dissimilar. So again, he shows Governor Prince here with his faithful hound dog. Now, Governor Prince had been wounded in a battle in the 30 Years' War, so he's walking with a cane. And I pity his poor horse. He was a cavalry officer. But they made him governor, and he was governor here for a little over 10 years. And on the whole, he did a pretty good job. Now, Carl Milles, I never had an opportunity to meet the man. I would like to have. Apparently had a sense of humor. Here he shows the Swedish town of Göteborg, or Gothenburg if you try to read it in English. And he shows the very short distance between Sweden and Delaware. He shows the Kalmar Nickel sailing along. He shows the requisite sea monster that you just have to have in such carvings. But then he shows what's attractive about Delaware. Well, they have good fishing. They have turkeys. They have deer. He didn't try to carve the antlers. They have bison, and they have beaver. So this is a good place for us to come, is the basic message. But then if we back up a little, up above, he shows another, this is a guy with a sense of humor. He shows William Penn arriving from the smaller boat and big ship, taking his first steps in the New World, where he is being greeted by Swedes who've been here for 2 generations. The English king has granted this land to William and the Penn family, but here he is. The first 2 years he was here, he lived in a Swedish home in what is now the town of Newcastle, while his mansion was being built. And then one more carving here that I find fascinating. This is a story. We have 3 separate letters, and in those days not everybody could read and write, so the fact that we have 3 letters that all basically tell the same story about this. On the 3rd voyage of the Kalmar Nickel, as an aside, of the original colonizing ships, none of them made more than 2 voyages to the New World except the Kalmar Nickel. She made 4. So on the 3rd voyage, they brought over a large breeding stallion, both to do heavy work and to breed. The native people had had ponies like the ones at Assateague for about 50 years by this time. They were becoming horse people, but they'd never seen an animal like this. The modern breed, if you want to look it up, is a Belgian. If you don't know what a Belgian looks like, think Clydesdale. It was a big horse. Well, it was here for a couple of weeks, and one night it disappeared. Now, we don't know what happened the next 2 nights, but then the native people brought the horse back. Now, as a breeding stallion, this horse would have been invaluable and irreplaceable to the native people. And it may be that that horse had a very good time for a couple of nights. I wasn't there, I don't know. But the Swedes who wrote back said this was proof of how the good relationship between the Swedes and the native people was not going to be jeopardized over one animal. That it was the wiser heads in the village, if in fact some young enterprising guy had stolen the horse, said, no, we have to bring this back. We can't keep this horse. And so they kept the uh, trade going. Now, this then first became New Sweden, then New Netherlands, then part of the what we now call the 13 colonies, um, consisting of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and part of Maryland. And so it kind of got lost in the history that this area wasn't predominantly English. I say it got lost in the history. It did not get lost in the reality. People are people. The Swedes and Finns kept coming over. Dutch people kept coming over. The Dutch, if you were a good neighbor, they were happy to do business with you. Then the next group that got put in charge of this area, Delaware and Pennsylvania, were the Quakers. If you were a good neighbor, the Quakers were fine getting along with you. So this area filled up famously the Pennsylvania Dutch, which technically is Deutsch. That's a lot of people from northern Germany. So it filled up with Europeans from northwestern Europe of all kinds. And if we then fast forward to 1775, the king and the parliament are not getting along well with the colonists. And the king and the parliament begin insisting, you people need to act like good Englishmen. Well, you could sell that line in Boston. Lots of Church of England people had come over to Boston. You could sell that in Virginia and the Carolinas. In Maryland, they had driven the Catholics out. After Charles II got on the throne after the Cromwell Revolution, he didn't like religious dissenters, partly because they'd cut his father's head off. He took that personally. And so they passed some very restrictive laws on anyone who was not Church of England. Imagine that you go to a Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist or Catholic or Quaker church or meeting house, but you also have to pay taxes to the Church of England because everybody's in the Church of England. You couldn't vote. You couldn't send your son to university. For the better part of a century, this went on. So when Parliament tried to tell people in this area, you need to act like good Englishmen, it was a hard sell. These people didn't feel like good Englishmen, either because they were from England and had been driven out for their religious views, or like the Pilgrims, or because they weren't English to begin with. And so that little village that I mentioned earlier of Nia Korsholm at the mouth of the Schuylkill, that we now call Philadelphia, that little village became the center of the American Revolution, partly because folks around here didn't feel like good Englishmen. They might have felt like good Swedes or good Dutchmen or good Quakers or good Methodists or Baptists or Presbyterians, but they didn't feel like good Englishmen. And I think we all know how that came out. Now, I had mentioned that the first black man, oh, a couple of shots here. These gentlemen from one of the Dutch master's paintings are wearing those beaver hats. This is a Rembrandt self-portrait. He was not as rich as these guys, so he had a smaller hat. But he was sure when he did the self portrait that he put his fancy hat in it. I mean, yes, that's what you do. So that's sort of fun. Here we have one of the original log cabins that's now up in Tinicum near the Philadelphia airport. Here we have the extent of New Sweden in the 17 years that it was New Sweden, from Fort Christina, that's Wilmington, Swedesboro, New Jersey, Neokorsholm, and all the way up to around Trenton. And so that's where they had spread to. Then we get into the history of why this is an Underground Railroad site. Now, Harriet Tubman, when she first escaped, came by foot, and she went to the center of the Delmarva Peninsula because it was easier to cross the rivers and creeks there, and made her way to the little village of Camden near Dover, Delaware. Camden, not the one in New Jersey. Um, Camden was a free black community in a period when Delaware was a slave state. This is my home state. It hurts to say that, but it's true. Um, and so she was taken in by some blacks. There was a family of blacksmiths who were black, and others. For the most part, black people were not allowed to live in the city of Dover, the state capital, unless they were house servants. So, some slaves, some servants. Uh, so she got hooked up with people there. They helped smuggle her up into Pennsylvania, and she went up to Canada. But then she decided she had to come back. Now, we had shown Anthony, the first settler here. If you drive down the street a little ways, you get to Anthony Swart Road. Well, as things progressed, a lot of the states, most of what became the states for some time or another, had slaves. But gradually it broke down into 13 slaves. And Delaware was a slave state. The last slaves in Delaware were not freed on Juneteenth of 1865. They weren't freed until December, when the 13th Amendment was passed outlawing slavery nationwide. But in the 1860 census, there were 21,644 blacks counted in Delaware, and of those, 91.6% were free. There were less than 9% slaves in Delaware. You can see it graphed here. Here's the line for free blacks starting with the 1790 census and going to 1860. Here's the line for slaves. So almost immediately by 1800, there were more free blacks in Delaware than slaves. Now that created an interesting situation for the Underground Railroad, because in most places in the South, if some black person was walking around by himself or in a small group, herself, and they didn't have a white person with them, some of the local whites would wonder, now what's going on here? I don't recognize them. And they might try to see if something was the matter here. In the Wilmington area where we are now, the whole county of Newcastle, there were only 250 slaves in the 1860 census. And they were part of a black community who were mostly free, who were a major part of the workforce here in Wilmington and the Wilmington area, and who were forming their own churches, some of which still exist. The Simpson Church in Newport, 2 churches in Wilmington. They were renting and then building simple, primitive schools for their children to learn to read and write. Some of the bright young men, the community and the church would pool efforts and send somebody off to a college in New England to get an education. Some of those guys came, it was men at the time, some of those guys came back as doctors and lawyers to help the community here. So you had a remarkable situation. Now, recent scholarship, this is not something I did, this is something, though, that's become very clear, is that of the people in the Underground Railroad period who actually escaped slavery, they didn't run away and get caught, They made it. Of those people, a third of them traveled long distances by water. If you were down in Louisiana or South Alabama or something and you were trying to get up to Ohio, the best way to do that was get on a riverboat and travel a long way by water. If you want to try to swim the Ohio River, good luck. So, um, when you're talking, though, about the East Coast, well, the slave states, Maryland and Virginia, and you come up here, Delaware, and after the Fugitive Slave Act passed, even the docks at Philadelphia, they needed to travel by ocean going schooners, big schooners, sailboats. And so, for example, a Captain Fountain, who was a Quaker captain, would do a circuit of the cities along the Chesapeake Bay. He would do um, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Norfolk. And then he would come up here. And before he went to the docks at Philadelphia that were open and well lighted, or the docks in Wilmington that were a mile upriver that were well lighted, where there might be constables and slave catchers, before he would go there, he would send a message ahead and say, I'll be in on Thursday night. At first, he sent riders to do that, and then he started sending telegraphs. And so they would come in by those Wilmington blue rocks that still stuck out halfway in the river. Some lines would be thrown, and people would get off and be hidden in the homes of free blacks in this area. And then the white Quaker Thomas Garrett and from time to time Harriet Tubman would team up to get them smuggled up into Pennsylvania. We'll take a minute and look here at a few of the images. Here we have New Amsterdam. This is the southern tip of Manhattan as it was in those days. Now the Bowery is way down here because they've kept filling in the southern part of Manhattan. But here you have the wall that became Wall Street. Here you have the canal that's now Canal Street. Here you have Fort Amsterdam, which is now the block on which the Native American Museum sits. And here you have a wide gate in the wall, a big double gate. And this was a broad Native American trail that went all the way up to Manhattan on the Hudson River side. And Pierre Minuit, recognizing the value of having at least one especially broad street, kept it this way. And if you haven't already guessed, they gave it the name Broadweg, which we now call Broadway. So if you have your theater tickets handy, good for you. Anyway, let's fast forward to when the Swedes decided to give us that monument. We're jumping to 1936 and 7. This area during the Great Depression was a bankrupt shipyard. It was a mess. When this picture was taken, they had already started to clean things up. It looked a lot worse than this. They sent a delegation from Sweden over to see where Fort Christina had been. And after being briefly a cannon battery in the War of 1812, the wood just rotted away. But the University of Delaware used ground penetrating radar to prove it was right here. So a Delaware delegation showed them the site. And they looked around at this industrial bankrupt mess and said, well, that's all very nice, but thank you for showing us. But we're not going to put a Carl Millis monument here. He's our greatest living sculptor. So that's the park as it was right after it opened. Here's the monument. These are the same sweet gum trees that have grown quite a bit since then. When they opened the park, President Franklin Roosevelt came, as did Prince Bertil from Sweden, and they each gave part of a national radio address. It was a very big deal. You can see from this photograph that the park looks close to the way it does now, except that the trees are very small. Planes flew overhead when they were having the dedication and took pictures. They somehow packed 10,000 people in this little park. It's sort of a Woodstock event. But how did it come to be a park then if it was an industrial waste site? When the Swedes said, well, we're not going to put a Carl Millis monument here, we'll put it in Philadelphia. That was part of New Sweden. the Delaware delegation kind of panicked and then said, "Oh, you need a park." And in 8 months, they built this park pretty much the way you see it now. This is my hometown. I ask myself how many families were saved in the middle of the Depression because Dad could get work helping build this park. Look at all that brickwork, the ironwork, the tree planting, the clearing the ground, and all. So, this quiet little park actually had a significant impact at the time. Um, just to cover a couple of the images here, it's going to be hard to see on the video. I mentioned the Peter Lindstrom map from 1654. Here's the size scale on the side of the map. Here's Fort Christina. Here are the first 3 log cabins. This is an apple orchard. Here are fields for wheat and hay. A year later, when the Dutch took over, this is a Dutch military engineer's picture of the same thing. Swamp, 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 swamp. By then, the Swedes knew the Dutch were coming. They had dug a moat across so that they were protected all the way around by water. But back where I started the tour, there's where the one cannon battery was, one over there, and one across the river. So they were legitimately surrounded, and they ran out of food. So there you have Gustavus Adolphus being wounded in battle. You have Queen Christina, this remarkable woman from the 17th century. Uh, you have all sorts of different things. Before this ever became even a shipbuilding area, this was a picture right after they had quarried out the rocks to widen the river for the shipbuilding. And so you see a lot of pictures there. We'll see a few more on the next poster up here. And so it is a remarkable thing to me that such a small little space can be so tied into key moments in American history. The church up the road, which is also a National Historical Site, is called Old Swedes Church, but it was built in 1695. By that time, this was being run by the English. But the Swedes kept coming over. They kept replenishing new ministers for the church. Finns kept coming over. The people who are descendants, who do the genealogy, tell me that almost 250,000 Americans are now direct descendants of New Sweden, of the New Sweden colonists. And I had mentioned Anthony Swart. Well, he's mentioned 4 times in the histories. The last time we have a written description of Anthony, he'd been given a license to trade for furs. Then the Dutch took over. Well, what is clear is that Anthony wanted nothing to do with the Dutch. They were the ones who took him as a slave. So what is not clear is what happened next. For a long time, folks from Sweden have claimed that he went back to Sweden and married a Swedish woman, and they all lived happily ever after, as they say. Well, other historians in Sweden have searched the records, church records and official records, and found no mention of him. The Lenape, on the other hand, claim that's just silly. We know better. He came to live with the Lenape. He spoke fluent Lenape. He married a Lenape woman. And there are now people in Wilmington who claim they are direct descendants of Anthony Swart. I have no way to dispute them. I'm hoping that DNA science can get refined enough that we can prove that, because I would think that would be a marvelous little bit of history to prove. So, as I like to say to people, what do we have here? We have this little bitty park. It's a nice green space in an urban area of East Wilmington. So it's nice to have a good green space. We have very good fishing. We are open from Memorial Day to Labor Day, Saturdays and Sundays in September, Saturdays in October. You're welcome to come any of those times. And so we have what else? A monument. We have what's left of some rocks, and we have where a fort used to be. It really isn't very much, but it's a whole lot of history. And that's pretty much how I like to tell the story of this little bitty park that we have here. My name's Herb Connor. Please come visit. Um, if you're going to come and you've already seen this, I'm going to have to come up with some new stuff for you. I'll take that as a personal challenge. Okay? We good?
Yeah, you good. All right, brother. Thank you. This
Hey.
Rasta Pops and family.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to show you the entrance of the park
That's fine.
and a mirror on the wall.
Yeah, the mural is, that was a city arts project from a few years ago when they were going to reopen the park.
Mm.
It had been closed for a period and not maintained very well. But then when the National Park Service got involved, things started to change. So this was a city arts project, this mural. And it shows various stages. On the right-hand side, you have the modern recreation of the tall ship Kalmar Nickel. If any of your folks are interested in actually being on the crew of a tall ship, they can not only pay for a day sail, but they can come join the crew.
Mm.
And my daughter was on the crew all through high school. I am an active crewman since 1998, crew class number 1. And so further down then, we show the building of the modern ship. We show individual portraits of Captain Lauren in the black hat and Captain Sharon over on the lower right, the two modern captains of the ship. We show the frame of the ship being built just a little to my right, 150 feet or so. We built it right here on the Christina River and launched it here. Now, further down then, we show this period of building sailboats right next door to where we are here for a while, and other kinds of ships in Wilmington. We show the dedication of the park there with the big excursion boats sitting out in the river, lots of people coming. That's not a very good portrait of FDR next to Prince Bertel, who has the forward hat, but it's supposed to be FDR. We have Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett. Thomas Garrett was the station master for the Underground Railroad. He was the white guy with the connections, but twice he was caught with slaves, runaways in his house, and both times his house was seized. The second time, he was taken to the federal court down in Newcastle, and the judge looked down with a scowl and said, "Mr. Garrett, I hope you've learned your lesson this time." Garrett stood up and said, "Your Honor, I shall continue to do this as long as I can draw breath."
Mm.
I would have liked to meet Thomas Garrett.
Yeah.
Sounds like my kind of guy.
Mm.
So we have the original Kalmar Nickel coming over, although the paint is starting to fade away. It's been a decade. We have a tent that's labeled Stuyvesant. That's when the Dutch West India Corporation did a hostile corporate takeover of the Swedish West India Corporation. We have the rocks shown in some blue and yellow colors there. Why they picked yellow, I don't know. And the fort behind it being drawn more or less to scale, unlike most of the other pictures that people have hypothesized of the fort. And we have the Lindstrom map recreated showing the large building, although they don't really show the stable. And then we have the first meetings of Pierre Minuit with the Lenape and the Susquehannocks and the exchange of goods. You may notice there's a river map just above their heads, and it shows the Christina River, or the Supekong, as the Lenape called it. And a little further up, we have the Wawasset, which we now call the Brandywine River, and we have the Minkwis Kill. Kill is the Dutch word for river, and that's the river further up which the Minkwis live, hence the Dutch name for it. So one of the remarkable things about New Sweden is, while it's real easy to make stuff up historically, we have good records on this stuff. The Swedes kept exceptionally good records. The Dutch kept good records too. So a lot of when they built the monument, 225,000 Swedes contributed to it.
Mm.
And some poor clerk with a big ledger book wrote down, the book still exists, wrote down all their names, addresses, and the amounts they contributed. Imagine doing that all day long for 250,000 people.
Mm.
So I just find this place history rich and fascinating.
It is. Definitely is.
Mm-hmm. That's what I got.
Yeah, definitely is.
If I'm a 17th century gentleman, I do that.
All right, tell me a little bit more about the entrance here.
About which?
The entrance.
Oh, the entrance to the park?
Yeah.
Well, that um, we've recently been looking at all kinds of engineering problems in the park,
Mm.
but it was thought at the time that the upright ironworks with the spikes on the top would resemble, in a way, the upright logs carved to a point on the top.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it kind of looks a little bit like a prison. But
That's why I said so.
yeah, well, there you are. But they were trying to give the sense of a fort, and again, they wanted the monument here. And so a lot of people come in and say, well, were these the original walls of Fort Christina? No, absolutely not. These were built for the 1938 dedication of the park. And I think that's the idea of making it look like Fort Delaware or something like a later fort would look.
Yes, brother. Thank you.
It is my pleasure.